In this video, I want to talk about why I think it's important that you build your own sound library and how I organize my samples and why I organize them a certain way. And then also show you a tool that I like to use to create more complex sound effects from these elements that I create myself. So I was just working on a new session to create trailer hits and elements for these hits. So stuff like this. So that's what I'm going to use as an example, but I use the same approach for all different kinds of sound effects. So maybe you have seen this in some of my videos before, that I have certain sections for my hits. So I have them organized into different elements. So I have my body layers, pre-whoosh layers, punch layers, and sub layers. And so the purpose of all of this is that I can sort of mix and match them and create a lot of different sound effects just from all these individual elements. And so for example, I do the same for snares, so I have my transients, I have my percussion samples, and then I have my noise samples. And by combining all of these, I can easily create a lot of different variations, a lot of different snare sounds. Once you have your library set up like this, and it keeps growing and growing, it's going to be a lot easier for you to just create a lot more different sounds and more complex sounds. And so a tool that I really like to use for this, because it fits my workflow really well, is called Soundweaver by Boom Library. And now you're going to understand why I organize my samples in a certain way and why it fits with this tool really well. So the basic idea here is that you can just choose different folders that contain certain samples. And by just clicking one button, you can create a lot of different variations. For my hits, for instance, I'll just choose the body layer folder. You can just enter keywords if you only want to use certain samples within that folder. Since I have it already organized this way, I can leave this empty, so it's going to use all the samples. I can just click randomize. I can change the amount of layers, so I could say I only want to use 2 layers here, but by clicking randomize, it's just gonna randomly switch these samples out. And you can also randomize pitch and position. So let's just see how I would go about this. I would just also use my punch layers. And instead of the sub layers, we can also use some of my boom sounds. I already know that I only want 1 layer of this. And for more punch, we can also add some kick samples. So let's just add these kicks as well. Maybe reduce this to 2 samples here. And now we can just click randomize and see what kind of versions we get. And so you can quickly test different combinations of these samples. And this plugin isn't really doing something that you can't do manually on your own directly in your DAW, but it's just gonna take you a lot longer. And why this actually works for this kind of stuff is because this software also does transient detections. So you could also, for instance, use whooshes that we've created. Just gonna exclude some sounds in here, maybe 2 layers of this. And as you can see, it detects the transient of the whoosh and just aligns them on the transient. Use more kick layers. You can also use VST plugins within this. But what I typically do is I export this to Ableton and then just work there. So whenever I have found a combination that I like, I can just prepare this for drag and drop. And then depending on the settings here, it's going to prepare the export. So I can also have actually each individual track exported or just the groups. That's my standard setting here. You can also tell it to do different variations of this, but I just want a current variation. And then what you can do is you can just go over to Ableton and drop them in here. And now we have the individual groups here. And now we can process this further with more effects, exchange layers. And as you can see, I've done this before as well. So these are all sounds that are created this way. And of course, you can use Soundweaver with third-party libraries and sound effects as well. But, if you want to sell your sound effects, you will have to use your own source sounds. And that's why I think that setting up your own library and building your own library constantly is very useful. Not only if you want to use this tool or similar tools, because before I had this tool, I just did all of this manually. So I would set up my samples the exact same way. I had these folders set up like this way before, and then I would just drag these samples into my DAW and exchange all of them manually, change the pitches manually, adjust the timing a little, so just so you get different variations. Obviously, this takes a lot longer than just using a randomize button in a software. But yeah, so the overall idea is that depending on what kind of sound effects you want to create, think about them in layers and then start sound designing these individual layers and bouncing them out so you can use them multiple times for different sound effects, for different variations of these sound effects. And once you start really building your library, you're gonna have so much material that whenever you need to create new sound effects. You're gonna have a lot of stuff for inspiration and a lot of stuff to play around with